The Secrets of the Dawn. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and realizing there's something in the darkness of your room, something that shouldn't be there. Now try ignoring some footsteps that you know aren't yours. Welcome to the channel. If you're a fan of chilling tales that keep you awake at night, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our terrifying stories. The clock read 3:12 a.m. its red digits burning like ominous eyes in the darkness. Harper sat upright in bed, her chest rising and falling rapidly, as if she'd just surfaced from drowning. Her room was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you aware of every small sound your body makes. The rush of blood, the tremble of breath, the faint rustle of fabric as you shift. She didn't know what had woken her. A dream, a noise, or worse, a presence. Her gaze darted around the room, her eyes adjusting to the heavy shadows. The faint glow of the streetlights outside trickled through the blinds, casting faint, uneven stripes across the walls. Everything seemed as it should be. The chair in the corner held the clothes she had lazily tossed over it earlier. Her desk was cluttered with notebooks and pens. But then, her stomach sank as her eyes fell on her bedroom door. It was open. The door, which she always locked before bed, stood ajar, a dark void leading to the hallway beyond. Her heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had forgotten to lock it tonight. Maybe the latch hadn't clicked properly. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Harper was meticulous about locking her doors. Every door, every night. She reached instinctively for her phone on the nightstand, but her hand met only cool, empty wood. A pang of fear shot through her. Where was it? She could have sworn she had left it there. Her fingers fumbled around the edge of the nightstand, growing more frantic with every passing second. Her breath quickened, her throat tightening. Then she saw them. On the floor, just beyond the edge of her bed, were footprints. Wet, glistening footprints that trailed from the open door to the foot of her bed. The shape of the prints was bizarre, irregular. They were too large to be hers and too heavy, as if whoever or whatever had left them was carrying an unbearable weight. The room felt colder now, an unnatural chill that made her breath visible in the dim light. She didn't want to look at them, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The prints seemed fresh, as though they had just been made. Her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Could someone have broken in? Was someone still here? The silence became oppressive, pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement. A creak of the floorboards, a rustle of fabric, even the faintest breath. But there was nothing, only the deafening roar of silence and the thunderous pounding of her heart. She wanted to get up, to run, to grab a weapon, anything to protect herself. But her body refused to move. It was as though she was rooted to the bed, her limbs locked in place by an unseen force. Her chest heaved as she tried to muster the courage to speak, to call out into the darkness. But what would she say? And worse, what if something answered? A sudden noise shattered the stillness, a faint, barely audible sound. A whisper. It was so soft that she couldn't be sure if it was real or a trick of her mind. But the words were unmistakable. "Why don't you look behind you?" Her entire body tensed, every muscle locking in place as terror surged through her veins. The whisper wasn't distant. It wasn't coming from the doorway or the hallway beyond. It was right next to her, so close she could feel the coldness of its breath on her ear. She clenched her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face as she fought the overwhelming urge to turn around. Every instinct screamed at her to stay still, to pretend she hadn't heard, to not acknowledge whatever it was that had spoken. But the whisper came again, this time lower, more insistent. "Look, behind. You." Her trembling hand gripped the edge of the blanket, pulling it up to her chin as though the thin fabric could somehow protect her. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but her voice was caught in her throat, trapped by the suffocating weight of fear. The air around her grew colder, so cold that her skin burned with the chill. She felt it then, a presence, something looming behind her, something she couldn't see but could feel. The sensation was unbearable, like 1,000 eyes boring into her back. It was watching her, waiting, taunting. And then, ever so lightly, she felt it. Fingers. Cold, skeletal fingers brushing against her arm, leaving a trail of icy dread in their wake. Her breath hitched, her body trembling uncontrollably. She whipped her head around, unable to resist any longer, her eyes wide with terror. But there was nothing there. The room was empty, just as it had been before. The door was still ajar, the footprints still glistening on the floor. But the presence lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her with its malevolent energy. Harper sat frozen, clutching the blanket like a lifeline, her mind reeling. She knew she wasn't alone. Something was in the room with her, something she couldn't see, but could feel in every fiber of her being, and it wasn't leaving. The weight of silence hung heavy in the room as Harper sat frozen on the bed, her breathing shallow, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her eyes darted toward the wet footprints again, following their path to the door. They seemed to shimmer faintly, as though the moisture was fresh, glistening under the faint light of the clock's digits. Yet there was no sign of anyone else. The thought churned in her mind like a sickness. Who made them? She tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a leak, she thought, though she knew that was impossible. It hadn't rained for days, and there was no plumbing near her bedroom. Maybe she had done it herself somehow, without realizing, but that didn't make sense either. The size and shape of the footprints, too large, almost claw-like, defied reason. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the mattress, forcing herself to move. Her muscles felt like lead, her limbs sluggish and uncooperative, as though the very air around her had thickened into an invisible mire. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet brushing the cold hardwood floor. The sound of her own breath echoed in her ears, too loud, too fast. She reached out to the nightstand again, hoping against hope that her phone might somehow be there after all. But it wasn't. The empty space seemed to mock her, and the creeping sense of vulnerability tightened its grip. The footprints were still there. They led from the door to the edge of the bed, stopping just short of where she now sat. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had been standing there, silently watching her as she slept. A sudden noise shattered the suffocating silence, a faint, almost imperceptible creak from the hallway beyond the door. Harper's head snapped up, her pulse thundering in her ears. The sound was so quiet that it could have been dismissed as the settling of old wood. But to Harper, it was deafening. Someone was out there. She stood slowly, her knees wobbling beneath her weight. Each step toward the door felt like an eternity, the distance stretching unnaturally as her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn back, to hide. But she couldn't. She had to know, she had to see. The hallway beyond the door was shrouded in darkness, an abyss that seemed to swallow the weak glow of the streetlights from the living room windows. Harper hesitated, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. Her heart was a frantic drumbeat in her chest, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. The word felt ridiculous as soon as it left her lips. Who was she expecting to answer? And if someone did, what would they say? The hallway didn't reply, but the oppressive silence seemed to grow heavier, more sinister. Harper stepped forward, her bare feet cold against the hardwood. Her eyes struggled to pierce the darkness, her imagination filling in the gaps with horrors she couldn't quite articulate. The creak came again, louder this time. It was followed by another and another, a steady rhythm of footsteps moving farther down the hall. Harper froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound wasn't coming toward her, it was moving away. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, she reached for the light switch on the wall. Her fingers brushed against the plastic, trembling as she flicked it on. The bulb sputtered weakly before flaring to life, casting a dim, flickering light across the hallway. It was empty. The footprints were gone. The polished hardwood stretched out before her, pristine and undisturbed. Harper's eyes darted to every corner, every shadow, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of electricity and the distant groan of the building settling. She turned her head to glance back at her room, her gaze falling on the clock. It still read 3:12 a.m. She frowned, her stomach knotting. That couldn't be right. She had been awake for what felt like hours. How had the time not changed? Her unease deepened as a low, guttural hum began to resonate from somewhere deep within the apartment. It was a sound she couldn't place, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It wasn't a mechanical noise. No, this was something organic, something alive. The vibration grew louder, resonating in her chest, making her teeth ache. She clutched at her head, desperate to block it out, but it was inside her now, crawling beneath her skin. She stumbled back into the hallway, her back pressing against the cold wall as she tried to steady herself. Then the light flickered again, and the hallway changed. The once familiar space twisted before her eyes, the walls narrowing and stretching unnaturally. Shadows spilled across the floor like ink, pooling in impossible shapes. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath burning her lungs. And then she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the flickering light, a figure stood. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. Its head tilted slowly, as though studying her, and Harper felt the weight of its gaze even though she couldn't see its eyes. Her breath hitched, and a low, raspy whisper cut through the air. "You're not alone." The lights went out. The darkness was suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was heavy, oppressive, as though the shadows themselves had weight and were pressing in on her. Harper's heart pounded in her chest like a drum, each beat echoing in her ears. She pressed her back against the wall, her fingers clawing at the smooth surface, desperate to ground herself in the nightmare that had become her reality. The whisper lingered in the air, circling her like a predator stalking its prey. "You're not alone." The words reverberated low and guttural, their tone alien and wrong, like a voice imitating human speech, but failing to mask the underlying malevolence. Harper squeezed her eyes shut, her lips trembling as she mouthed silent prayers, begging for the nightmare to end. But it didn't. A faint, rhythmic tapping broke through the suffocating silence. It was distant at first, but it grew louder with every passing second. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was deliberate, calculated, like someone, or something, was announcing its presence. Harper's breathing quickened as she strained to locate the source. Then it stopped. She opened her eyes. Her pupils dilated in the impenetrable darkness. The hallway stretched before her, endless and unfamiliar, no longer resembling the narrow space she had walked down 100 times before. Her hands trembled as she reached out, feeling her way along the wall. "Who's there?" she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse and shaking. No answer came, but the air grew colder, the chill biting at her skin like icy needles. A low rumble began to emanate from the walls, a sound so deep it was more felt than heard. Harper's teeth chattered as she stumbled forward, her bare feet barely making a sound against the floor. And then she heard it again. The tapping. Only now it wasn't distant. It was right behind her. Harper froze, her entire body locking in place as terror coursed through her veins. She didn't dare turn around. The presence behind her was palpable, an overwhelming force that seemed to fill the space. She could feel it breathing. A slow, deliberate inhale and exhale that sent chills racing down her spine. "Go ahead," the voice rasped, so close she could feel the vibrations of its words. "Turn around." Her knees buckled and she fell to the floor, her hands slapping against the cold wood. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head violently, refusing to obey. The voice chuckled, a deep, guttural sound that resonated with malice. "You can't hide," it said, its tone mocking. "I see you." The tapping started again, slow and deliberate, circling her like a predator stalking its cornered prey. Harper's breath came in shallow gasps as she crawled forward, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness. Her fingertips scraped against the floor, searching for anything she could use to defend herself, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, devoid of anything familiar. A sharp, sudden pain shot through her leg, and she screamed, the sound raw and guttural. She turned her head, her wide eyes searching for the source, but there was nothing there, only the darkness. The pain lingered, a searing, burning sensation that felt as though something had clawed its way into her skin. "Do you feel it now?" The voice taunted, its tone dripping with malice. "You invited me in. This is what you wanted." "I didn't," Harper cried out, her voice cracking. "I didn't invite you. I don't even know what you are." The laughter that followed was deafening, a cacophony of distorted voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It filled her head, drowning out her thoughts, each laugh more chilling than the last. "You did," the voice hissed, suddenly calm. Every glance at the shadows, every thought that something might be there. "You called to me. You've been calling for a long time." Harper's mind reeled, her thoughts spiraling into chaos. She clawed at her ears, desperate to drown out the voice, but it was inside her now, echoing through her skull. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her as she stumbled forward. The hallway seemed to warp around her, the walls bending and twisting in impossible ways. Doors appeared and disappeared, flickering in and out of existence like images on a broken television. The tapping followed her, relentless and unyielding, always just out of reach. Finally, she reached the end of the hallway, or what she thought was the end. A door loomed before her, massive and foreboding, its surface covered in scratches and deep gouges. The handle was cold beneath her hand, its icy touch sending shivers up her arm. "Open it," the voice commanded, its tone a mixture of anger and glee. "You can't run from me. Open the door." Harper hesitated, her breath hitching in her throat. She wanted to turn back, to run, but the hallway behind her had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of darkness. She was trapped. With trembling hands, she gripped the handle and turned it slowly, the metallic creak echoing through the void. As the door swung open, a blinding light poured through, illuminating the space beyond. Harper shielded her eyes, squinting against the brightness. At first, she thought it was a way out, a chance to escape the nightmare, but as her vision adjusted, she saw what lay beyond, and her stomach turned. The room was filled with mirrors. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, endless reflections of herself staring back at her. But something was wrong. The reflections didn't move as she did. They stood still, their expressions twisted into malevolent grins, their eyes dark and hollow. And then, one by one, they began to step forward. Harper stumbled backward, her heel scraping against the doorframe as the reflections advanced. The mirrors rippled like disturbed water, their surfaces shimmering with unnatural light as each distorted version of herself stepped through. They moved fluidly, yet unnaturally, their limbs bending at impossible angles, their heads tilting too far to one side as though their necks had been broken. "Stay back!" she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her panic. Her words bounced off the mirrored walls, echoing back at her, but twisted and wrong, like a chorus of mocking voices. The reflections didn't respond. They didn't need to. Their expressions said it all. They were hungry. She turned, desperate to run, but the door she had entered through was gone, swallowed by the labyrinth of mirrors. Each reflection now loomed closer, their grins widening, exposing jagged teeth that no human mouth should possess. Their eyes, dark voids, seemed to follow her every move, pinning her under their gaze. One of the reflections reached out, its elongated arm piercing through the glass with a shattering crack. Harper stumbled back, watching in horror as its hand emerged from the mirror, long fingers tipped with razor-sharp claws. The sound of cracking glass echoed all around her as more hands began to push through the mirrors, shattering the thin barrier between her and them. "Where are you going, Harper?" A voice cooed, low and serpentine. It was her voice, but not her. It came from one of the reflections, the sound dripping with malice. "You can't escape yourself. You've already let us in." The room seemed to shrink around her, the mirrored walls pressing closer, the reflections multiplying, each one more grotesque than the last. Their laughter filled the space, a cacophony of madness that made her ears ring. She clutched her head, her knees buckling as the overwhelming noise drowned out her thoughts. "Stop it! Stop!" she screamed, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her face. But the laughter only grew louder, more distorted, until it was no longer laughter but a deafening roar that reverberated through her very bones. Then, everything stopped. Silence. Harper opened her eyes, her breath hitching as she looked around. The mirrors were still there, but the reflections were gone. The room was empty, save for her trembling form. The silence was oppressive, pressing against her ears and making her hyper-aware of every sound her body made. The shaky intake of breath, the pounding of her heart, the faint rustle of her clothes as she moved. But then she noticed something. Her reflection, the one directly in front of her, wasn't mirroring her movements. It stood perfectly still, its dark eyes locked onto hers. Harper froze, her breath catching in her throat as she stared back at it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the reflection tilted its head, a sinister smile spreading across its face. "You're not supposed to be here," it whispered, its voice barely audible yet cutting through the silence like a blade. Harper stumbled back, her hands fumbling against the smooth surface of another mirror. The reflection in front of her began to move, its body contorting unnaturally as it pressed itself against the glass. Its hands clawed at the surface, leaving deep scratches that seemed to bleed darkness. Desperation surged through her as she turned, her eyes darting around the room for any sign of escape. The mirrors surrounded her on all sides, their surfaces warping and rippling as though alive. She ran toward the nearest one, slamming her fists against it, but it didn't shatter. The glass absorbed the impact, distorting her reflection into a grotesque, unrecognizable form. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding against the mirror until her hands throbbed with pain. But the room remained unyielding, a twisted prison designed to trap her. Behind her, the reflections began to reappear one by one. They emerged from the mirrors like shadows peeling away from the light, their forms shifting and twisting as they stepped into the room. Harper turned, her chest tightening as the crowd of doppelgangers surrounded her, their grins widening impossibly. "This is your fault," one of them hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "You called us. You looked too long into the darkness, and now the darkness is looking back." "No," Harper whimpered, shaking her head. I didn't mean to." The reflections surged forward, their movements erratic and jerky, like marionettes controlled by a deranged puppeteer. Harper stumbled back, her breath hitching as they closed in, their distorted faces inches from hers. "You can't escape," they said in unison, their voices blending into a chilling harmony. "We are you, and you are us. There's no one watching, only you watching yourself." The mirrors exploded outward, shards of glass raining down around her. Harper screamed, shielding her face with her arms as the shards seemed to dissolve before hitting the ground. When she opened her eyes, the room was gone. She stood in complete darkness, the oppressive void wrapping around her like a shroud. The air was thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. In the distance, a faint light flickered, drawing her attention. She moved toward it, her steps hesitant and unsteady. As she drew closer, she realized the light was coming from a single mirror, standing alone in the void. Her reflection stared back at her, its face calm and expressionless. Harper reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the surface. The reflection smiled, and then it spoke. "You'll never be alone again." The mirror shattered, plunging her back into darkness. Harper awoke to the sound of faint whispers, a low murmur that seemed to seep into her consciousness like a cold mist. Her body was sprawled across an unfamiliar floor, its texture rough and cold against her skin. Her head throbbed with a dull ache, and when she opened her eyes, she found herself surrounded by an endless expanse of shifting shadows. The air was dense, almost syrupy, making each breath feel labored. As she pushed herself up, her palms scraped against the surface beneath her, stone, rough and uneven. The light was dim, coming from no discernible source, casting eerie shapes and distorted silhouettes that danced across the walls of what seemed to be a cavernous space. She tried to stand, her legs weak and trembling, but her movements felt sluggish, as if some unseen force were pulling her down. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of disjointed voices that seemed to emanate from every direction. Some were frantic, pleading, while others were cold and accusing, their words merging into an incomprehensible symphony of dread. "Where am I?" Harper's voice was barely above a whisper, her words swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. She turned in a slow circle, her eyes darting around in search of anything familiar. The cavern stretched endlessly, its jagged walls appearing to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the whispers. And then she saw it. Far in the distance, a figure stood motionless, its silhouette stark against the shadows. It was tall and skeletal, its proportions all wrong. Its head was tilted to one side, and its arms hung unnaturally long, almost brushing the ground. Harper froze, her blood turning to ice as the figure began to move, its steps slow and deliberate. The whispers around her shifted, their tone growing sharper, more menacing. Words began to emerge from the chaos, each one dripping with malice. "You don't belong. You've seen too much. You can't leave." Panic surged through her veins as she took a step back, her foot catching on a jagged stone. She stumbled, barely managing to catch herself, her eyes never leaving the advancing figure. It moved with an unnatural grace, its long limbs swaying as it closed the distance between them. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice breaking as she scrambled to her feet. But the figure didn't stop. Its movements quickened, its pace becoming erratic, jerky, like a puppet with its strings cut and hastily reattached. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, filling her head with screams and laughter, each sound stabbing into her skull like needles. She clutched her head, her knees buckling as the weight of the noise threatened to crush her. "You called us," a voice hissed, low and guttural, cutting through the cacophony like a knife. Harper's head snapped up, her breath hitching as she realized the voice was coming from the figure. "You opened the door, and now it cannot be closed." "I didn't mean to," Harper cried, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what I did. Just leave me alone." The figure stopped, its head tilting further, the motion unnatural and grotesque. "Alone?" it repeated, its voice a distorted echo. "You've never been alone. Not even in the quiet moments, not even when you thought you were safe." Harper's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably. The figure loomed over her now, its shadow stretching impossibly long, swallowing her in its darkness. She couldn't see its face, if it had one, but she could feel its gaze, an unbearable weight pressing down on her soul. The whispers suddenly stopped, replaced by a silence so absolute it was almost deafening. Harper's breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps as the figure leaned closer, its presence overwhelming. "You wanted the truth," it whispered, its voice low and venomous. "And the truth is this: you are the watcher and the watched. You are the prey and the predator. You are the darkness you fear." Harper shook her head violently, her sobs racking her body. No, that's not true. I'm just me. I'm not." "You are us," the figure interrupted, its voice rising, 100 voices speaking as one. "And we are you." The cavern began to shift, the shadows around her writhing like living things. Faces emerged from the darkness, grotesque and malformed, their mouths twisted into sinister grins. They whispered her name over and over, their voices dripping with malice. Harper clutched her head, screaming as the faces drew closer, their hollow eyes boring into her. "Stop it! Please, stop it!" But there was no escape. The shadows swallowed her whole, the faces merging into the darkness, until there was nothing left but the sound of her own breathing. And then she woke up. Her eyes flew open, and she found herself back in her bedroom. the familiar glow of the clock illuminating the darkness. 3:12 a.m. She sat up, her chest heaving as she looked around, her mind racing to make sense of what had happened. It had to have been a dream, a nightmare born from exhaustion and fear. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the floor, leading from the door to her bed, were wet footprints, and they weren't hers. The footprints glistened in the faint glow of the clock, each step soaked into the fibers of the carpet. Harper's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place as her mind struggled to rationalize what she was seeing. They were large, too large for her own feet, and irregular, with splotches of dark liquid trailing off the edges. She leaned forward cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the nearest print. Her fingers stopped just shy of the damp outline, and an icy chill radiated from it, sending a shiver up her spine. The air smelled faintly of earth and decay, as though something had been dragged in from the depths of a forgotten grave. Harper straightened, her eyes darting to the door, which was still locked. She had checked it before going to bed. The realization struck her like a punch to the gut. Whatever had made those prints hadn't entered the room. It had already been inside. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she scanned the shadows, her vision swimming with the fear of what might be lurking just out of sight. The room was quiet, too quiet, save for the faint hum of the clock and the sound of her own ragged breathing. And then, a creak. It came from the corner of the room where the shadows were thickest, pooling like ink. Harper's head snapped toward the sound, her muscles locking as she stared into the black void. At first, there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness pressing against her senses. But then she saw it, a faint glimmer of movement like the shifting of fabric. Her eyes strained to focus, and the shape became clearer. A figure hunched and unnatural, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an impossible angle. It didn't move closer. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to suffocate her with a wave of primal terror. Harper's instinct screamed at her to run, to bolt out of the room and never look back. But her legs felt like lead, her body rooted to the spot by an invisible force. The figure tilted its head further, the motion slow and deliberate as though it were studying her. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to rise, its elongated limbs unfolding like a grotesque puppet being pulled upright. The movement was silent, each motion fluid yet disjointed, as if the creature were learning how to mimic a human form. "I see you," it finally rasped, its voice low and guttural, like the sound of gravel being crushed underfoot. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, filling the room with an oppressive dread. Harper's throat tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to form a coherent thought. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice cracking. The figure stepped closer, the wet slap of its feet against the carpet sending a jolt of terror through her. "You invited me," it said, its tone almost mocking. "Every glance over your shoulder, every flicker of doubt. You opened the door." Harper shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No, I didn't. I didn't mean to." The figure let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound that seemed to resonate through the walls. "Intent doesn't matter," it said, its voice splitting into multiple tones, each one more distorted than the last. "You noticed me, and now I'm here." The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting as frost began to creep across the windows. Harper's breaths came out in visible puffs, her body shivering uncontrollably. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, twisting and writhing like living things, closing in on her. Desperate, she scrambled toward her bedside table, her hand fumbling for her phone. The cold had numbed her fingers, making it nearly impossible to grip the device. When she finally managed to grab it, she turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. The figure recoiled, its form dissolving into the shadows as the light touched it. For a brief moment, Harper felt a surge of hope. She turned the flashlight toward the corner, scanning the room for any sign of the intruder. But the room was empty. The wet footprints remained, stark against the pale carpet. But the figure was gone. The shadows had retreated, leaving her alone in the pale glow of the flashlight. Harper collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling with relief and residual terror. She clutched the phone to her chest, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she tried to process what had just happened. But then, the phone buzzed in her hand. The screen lit up with a notification, a single text message from an unknown number. "You can't escape me, Harper. I'm always watching." The flashlight flickered, and the room plunged into darkness once more. The darkness felt alive. It pressed against Harper's skin, suffocating and oppressive, as if the room had suddenly been submerged in a thick, unyielding fog. Her heart thundered in her chest as the phone slipped from her trembling fingers, landing on the floor with a dull thud. The faint glow of the screen was swallowed by the shadows almost instantly. She froze, every muscle in her body locking into place. It was the kind of fear that overrode thought, that primal instinct to stay still when a predator was near. But this was no ordinary predator. This was something far worse, something unnatural, something she didn't understand but could feel in the marrow of her bones. The sound of breathing filled the room. It wasn't hers. It was slow and wet. A rattling inhale followed by a low, guttural exhale, as if whatever was in the room struggled with the very act of drawing air. Harper's chest tightened, her breath shallow and uneven as she tried to locate the source of the sound. It came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the stillness like an omnipresent reminder of the thing lurking in the dark. "Harper." The voice was low and distorted, crackling like static over a failing speaker. It came from the direction of her bed, impossibly close. She bolted upright, her hands fumbling for anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the bedside lamp, and she gripped it tightly, her knuckles whitening. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the oppressive silence. The breathing stopped. For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, the mattress behind her dipped, as if someone or something had just climbed onto it. Harper screamed, throwing herself off the bed and onto the floor. The lamp slipped from her grasp, shattering against the ground and plunging the room into an even deeper abyss of darkness. She scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the carpet, her eyes straining to see anything in the pitch black. The mattress creaked again, the sound slow and deliberate, as though whatever was there was shifting its weight. She could feel it watching her, its gaze burning into her even though she couldn't see it. "You can't hide," the voice rasped, closer now, so close it felt as though it was whispering directly into her ear. "You invited me in. I belong here now." Harper's back hit the wall, her fingers scraping against the cold plaster as she searched desperately for a light switch. The sound of wet, dragging footsteps filled the room, each step slow and deliberate, moving toward her. Her hand finally found the switch. She flicked it on, and the room was bathed in dim, flickering light. Nothing was there. The bed was empty, the footprints gone, the air still and silent, but the oppressive feeling of being watched hadn't left. It was stronger now, more tangible, as if the shadows themselves were alive, their inky tendrils reaching out to brush against her skin. The phone buzzed again. Harper's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes locking onto the faint glow of the screen where it had landed on the floor. She hesitated, her stomach churning with dread, before crawling toward it on shaking limbs. The screen displayed another message. "Turn around." Her blood ran cold. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as tears blurred her vision. "No, no, no." But she couldn't stop herself. Her body moved of its own accord, her head turning slowly as if compelled by an invisible force. Standing in the corner of the room was the figure. Its elongated limbs were folded awkwardly, its head tilted at an even more grotesque angle. The flickering light played tricks on its form, making it seem like it was vibrating, its edges blurring in and out of focus. Its face, or what passed for one, was featureless, save for two empty black voids where its eyes should have been. Yet Harper could feel its gaze, piercing and unrelenting, burrowing into her soul. The figure took a step forward, and the light flickered violently, plunging the room into brief intervals of darkness. With each flash, It was closer, its movements disjointed and wrong, like a marionette controlled by unsteady hands. Harper screamed, her voice raw and desperate as she threw the phone at the creature. The screen shattered, the pieces scattering across the floor, but it didn't stop. It loomed over her now, its shadow swallowing her whole, its presence overwhelming. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice a chilling harmony of many voices speaking as one. "You can't run. You can't hide. You let me in, Harper, and now I'll never leave." The light flickered one last time before going out completely. The last thing Harper saw was its face, or rather the absence of it, as the darkness consumed her. And then, silence. Harper's eyes snapped open, her chest heaving with gasps of panic. The silence was deafening. She was back in her room. But something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The bed beneath her was cold, too cold, as if the warmth had been drained from it completely. Her fingers trembled as she pushed herself upright, the shadowy remnants of the nightmare lingering in her vision like an aftertaste, foul and suffocating. Her phone lay next to her, but the screen was cracked and dark. She had thrown it at the figure, hadn't she? But now it was back on her bed, perfectly placed beside her as though nothing had happened. She reached for it, her hand shaking as her fingers grazed the shattered surface. The jagged pieces of glass dug into her skin, but she barely noticed. The unease had already settled deep within her, an insidious, gnawing feeling that she couldn't shake. Something was here. She glanced around, her eyes flicking across the room in quick, panicked movements. The air felt thick, dank and suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in. The shadows clung to the corners, twisting and writhing as though alive. And yet, there was no clear source for them. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly realized that the room had changed. It wasn't the same. The walls were no longer the soft, familiar beige of her apartment. They were dark and damp, covered in what looked like layers of black mold and grime. The window, once clear, was now cracked, its glass covered in a web of fine fractures, the edges smeared with dark stains. The air smelled faintly of rot, an earthy stench that clung to everything. Her heart began to pound as her gaze moved toward the door. It was ajar, just barely, a sliver of dark nothingness beyond it. The whispering had started again, low, distant murmurs that seemed to be coming from behind the door, just out of reach. Harper's entire body tensed. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, the sensation that something, or someone, was just beyond her sight. She stood slowly, her legs weak and unsteady, her knees shaking as she took a step toward the door. The floor creaked beneath her feet, the sound louder in the silence than it should have been. She couldn't hear the outside world. There were no cars passing by, no distant sounds of the city. There was only the oppressive, suffocating quiet that threatened to crush her under its weight. The whispers grew louder as she approached the door, rising into frantic pleas, desperate murmurs that sounded too familiar. Harper's pulse raced, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She reached out and touched the doorknob, the cold metal seeping into her palm, sending a chill up her arm. She hesitated. "Harper." The voice came again, but this time it was different. It was softer, closer, unmistakably human. She flung the door open, her breath catching as she stepped into the hallway. The darkness beyond the threshold was impenetrable, the walls stretching impossibly far in both directions. She could hear the whispers now, echoing in the distance, a distorted chorus of voices that made her blood run cold. The hallway felt endless, as though it had no beginning or end, stretching out in every direction. Harper turned quickly, her head snapping back toward her room. But when she looked behind her, there was nothing there. The door to her bedroom was gone. In its place was an expanse of black, a void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. Her heart pounded, panic rising in her chest as she realized she was no longer in her apartment. This wasn't her home. This wasn't even a place she recognized. The walls seemed to shift before her eyes, distorting and morphing like a bad dream. The floors groaned beneath her feet, the sounds becoming more like whispers than creaks, like voices calling to her from the deep. "You can't escape." The voice was behind her again, It was no longer distant. It was right there, so close that she could feel its breath on her neck. Harper spun around, her body trembling with fear, but she saw nothing, and yet she knew. It was there. The figure, the thing that had been haunting her since the moment she first noticed it. It was everywhere now. She could feel its presence pressing in on her from all sides. The air grew thick, colder with each passing second, until she could see her breath in front of her, a cloud of vapor that seemed to hang in the air, refusing to dissipate. A low growl rumbled in the darkness, so deep it shook her bones. The sound came from above her, and as her gaze snapped upward, she saw it. Two glowing, empty eyes staring down at her from the ceiling. Harper gasped and staggered backward, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. She collided with the wall, her head spinning, her pulse racing. The eyes blinked, slowly, and then began to widen until they were impossibly large, filling her vision. "You've seen too much." The voice now came from all directions, layering on top of itself until it was no longer distinct. "You can never unsee it." Harper clutched her head, screaming as the walls around her pulsed and writhed, their surfaces rippling like water disturbed by some unseen force. The hallway was warping now, stretching into something twisted, like a never-ending maze. The whispers became louder, their voices all blending into one, a constant barrage of noise that clawed at her sanity. And then she felt it, a cold hand brushing her shoulder. She spun around, but there was nothing there. But the cold was still there, seeping into her skin, wrapping around her like chains, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't escape. The whispers became screams, the darkness closing in from all sides. The walls moved closer, inching toward her with each passing second. She reached out for the walls, desperate to find something to steady herself. But the surface was slick with something wet, something alive. And then the shadows rushed toward her, engulfing her, pulling her into the darkness as her scream was swallowed by the endless void. The last thing she heard was a faint whisper just before everything went silent. "You are one of us now." Harper awoke with a start. The air was thick and still, like the quiet before a storm. She gasped, her chest rising and falling with frantic breaths as she pushed herself up, her palms slick with sweat. The room felt wrong again, but this time it was more than just a vague sense of dread. Something had changed within her, something that she couldn't quite put into words. The room was dark, but it wasn't the deep, suffocating blackness from before. No, this was an eerie kind of dimness, a gray half-light that made the room appear like it had been drained of its color. Everything was hazy, as if the world itself had been muted, its edges softened and blurred. She could barely make out the contours of the walls, the shadows pooling in strange places, almost as though they were moving. She looked around, her breath hitching as she realized she was no longer in her apartment. The room, if it could even be called that, was small and barren, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust. The walls were cracked, their surfaces peeling and crumbling away, as if time itself was eroding them. The air smelled of mildew, stale and old, like a place that had been abandoned for years. Harper's heart raced as she stood, her legs unsteady, her body shaking with the cold. She moved toward the window, desperate for a sense of reality, a glimpse of the outside world to ground her. But when she reached the glass, she froze. There was no outside. The window was covered in layers of grime and dirt, the view beyond it obscured. But as she pressed her palm against the glass, she could feel something beyond it, something moving in the darkness. The feeling was subtle at first, but it quickly grew stronger. A subtle pressure, as if something was watching her from the other side, just out of reach. She could almost hear it now. Whispers, soft and distorted, too faint to understand but unmistakable. She stumbled back, her legs giving out beneath her as she fell to the floor. Her head was spinning, the room tilting with an unnatural spin that made her stomach churn. She clutched her head in her hands, trying to steady herself, but the whispers grew louder. "You can't escape. You're here now. You belong here." The voice, no, The multitude of voices flooded her mind, each one distinct and yet impossibly unified. It was the sound of everything around her, like a chorus of people speaking all at once. Harper's thoughts were drowning beneath the onslaught of voices, their words carving themselves into her brain. She stumbled to her feet, her vision blurry as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. She needed to get out. She had to get out. But the room felt wrong. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick with an invisible pressure that seemed to pulse and throb around her. The space itself seemed to breathe, as though it was alive, expanding and contracting with every breath she took. The whispers had stopped. In their place was a low, unrelenting hum. It reverberated through the very ground, vibrating up her spine, settling deep in her chest. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere, just like the breathing she had heard before. It was as though the room itself was speaking to her, communicating in a language she couldn't understand, but felt deep within her. Harper closed her eyes, squeezing them shut as tightly as she could, trying to block out the sound, the sensation of the room closing in around her. She tried to force her mind to go somewhere else, anywhere else, but it was impossible. The darkness seeped into her very bones, and with each passing second, the weight of the place grew heavier. When she opened her eyes again, she wasn't alone. A figure stood in the center of the room. Its outline was faint, barely visible, but it was there. A presence that made the air grow colder. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched beyond the limits of human form. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and Harper couldn't make out its features. The only thing that stood out were the eyes, dark, endless voids that seemed to devour the light around them. They stared at her, unmoving, unwavering, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Harper felt a wave of pure, unrelenting terror wash over her. The figure didn't speak, but Harper knew it was aware of her. She could feel its gaze, the cold, suffocating weight of its presence pressing down on her. The longer she stared at it, the more her vision warped, as though the figure was slowly distorting the very space around her. Her mind fractured. Her pulse thundered in her ears as her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The figure took a step toward her, and with each movement, the room seemed to bend, the walls stretching impossibly far, as though she was being sucked into the space between them. Her stomach turned as she tried to move, but her limbs were frozen, as if the very air had become thick and sticky. A whisper, so faint it was almost inaudible, floated through the space. "I see you." Harper's heart skipped a beat. The figure was getting closer, its shape becoming more defined with every second, its black eyes pulling her in, drawing her into their abyss. "No, no, no," Harper whimpered, shaking her head desperately, as though the action alone would push the figure away. But it didn't work. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward her, its fingers impossibly long, jagged at the tips like claws. Harper tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her throat was dry, her voice stolen by the weight of the thing before her, and then, as the figure's fingers brushed her face, the world exploded. Light, pain, shadows. The last thing Harper felt was a cold hand wrapping around her throat, and then everything went black. The whispers didn't stop. The whispers had never stopped. Harper's consciousness returned to her in a slow, suffocating crawl. She couldn't remember when or how she had fallen unconscious, but as her eyes fluttered open, she was met with a thick, oppressive darkness. It wasn't the kind of darkness that comforted or blanketed. It felt alive, pulsing with an unseen presence, like the very air around her was thick with something watching, waiting. The room was unfamiliar, but she couldn't place how. The walls were the same, rotted, warped wood, peeling in layers soaked with mildew. The air felt heavy, pressing against her chest, and the same stagnant, earthy scent lingered in her nostrils, suffocating her. Her head was pounding, her mind sluggish and confused, the memories from earlier a blurred montage of dread and horror that made no sense. Her fingers twitched as she slowly moved them against the cold, damp floor, feeling for some sense of grounding. She was lying down, but the position felt wrong. Her limbs were stiff, as though they were not her own, not fully under her control. A deep ache ran through her muscles as she sat up, her body protesting the movement. She looked around, but there was no escape. The air was still, thick with a sense of finality, as though the space itself was waiting for something, perhaps even for her to acknowledge what was about to happen. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat like a countdown to some inevitable end. But then, she saw it. There in the far corner of the room, a shadow. No, not a shadow, a shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline stretching unnaturally toward the ceiling. The thing she had sensed in her nightmares, the thing that had followed her, was now here, standing before her in this place she couldn't comprehend. Its eyes, those dark, endless voids, stared at her. Two hollow pits that seemed to grow larger the longer she looked at them. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure shifted slightly, its limbs folding in strange, unnatural ways, as if its joints didn't bend like a human's. It was almost as if it was made of shadows and darkness itself, a being that didn't belong in any known space. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't respond. The moment she met its gaze, she was paralyzed, her thoughts swirling, muddled by the oppressive presence that filled the room. The whispers began again, low at first, but they grew louder, filling every corner of her mind, drowning her thoughts. You cannot run. You cannot hide. You've already seen too much. The words didn't come from anywhere in particular. They came from inside her, swirling and writhing like a mass of serpents in her mind. She clutched her head in agony, feeling the pressure of the voices pushing against the fragile walls of her sanity. She could feel them moving through her, inside her. You belong to us now. Harper's hands began to shake uncontrollably, her nails digging into her scalp as she fought against the force overwhelming her mind. The figure's eyes never left her. It was as though it was feeding on her fear, drawing her deeper into its grasp, into its void. Her breathing quickened, shallow and erratic, as her body began to tremble with the intensity of the sensation. She felt cold to her very core, as if the warmth of life itself was being drained from her. With every breath, the air grew thicker, colder, until she couldn't feel her body anymore. She was fading, slipping into something she couldn't understand, something otherworldly. A low hum filled the space, vibrating through her chest, through her bones, resonating deep within her soul. And then, she heard it. The voice, clear now, cutting through the chaos of the other whispers. It's too late. Harper's eyes widened in terror as she understood. It wasn't just her mind it had invaded. It had always been here, waiting for her to open the door, waiting for her to take the first step. It had followed her from the very beginning, from the moment she felt its presence in the shadows. She had been marked the moment she stepped into its realm. Her body no longer felt like her own. Her limbs were rigid, her breath shallow, as though the very essence of her being was being consumed piece by piece. The darkness had crept into every corner of her existence, and now it was pulling her in completely, like a weightless force dragging her under. Her eyes began to flutter, the light in the room dimming even further, until all she could see were those eyes, those endless, dark eyes. They filled her vision completely, swallowing every ounce of reality, until it was only her and the darkness, only her and the thing that had been with her all along. A scream died in her throat as she felt herself being drawn toward it. The whispers reached their crescendo, and for a moment she could hear them all. The voices of those before her, those who had been trapped in this space, those who had seen too much and lost everything. They were her now, they were inside her now, and then there was nothing. If this story left you looking over your shoulder, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you're never alone with your thoughts. Who knows? Maybe you're being watched right now. Do you really think you're alone?